This past weekend, I had a debate with a libertarian who made a very interesting claim. He said that the Wild Wild West was actually a very peaceful time in U.S. history. At first glance, it appears as though he's right. This graph from the U.S. Census shows homicide rates throughout the 20th century and shows the homicide rate as little as 1 per 100,000 in the year 1900. Then I found this article on the Examiner, which says, "The myth of the Wild Wild West," and then goes on to say that the homicide rate in the Wild Wild West may have been as little as 1 per 100,000 residents for that year. Finding this very hard to believe, I did a little bit more research, and I also found this graph, which has two different quotes. One is from the U.S. Census, and another is from the guy named Ekberg, who apparently estimates the homicide rate back then to be much, much higher, like 7 per 100,000 in the year 1900. So naturally, what I did is I did a little bit of research, and I found the guy. Here we go. Estimates of early 20th century U.S. homicide rates, an econometric forecasting approach by Douglas Lee Ekberg. Bureau of the Census death registration records, as reported in mortality statistics, are a primary source for early 20th century U.S. homicide statistics. Those data appear to show a massive rise in homicide during the first decade of the century, with a continuous increase through 1933. This increase is quite at variance with the trend away from violence in other industrialized societies. During the first one-third of the century, however, death registration was incomplete. It occurred only in an expanding registration area that was composed in the earlier years, primarily of states with typically low rates of homicide. Further, in the first decade of the century, homicides within the registration area often were reported as accidental deaths. As a result, apparent increases in rates of homicides in the United States between 1900 and 1933 may be illusionary. Here's another source I found. Homicide Trends in America, 1850 to 1950, by Megan Sasson. Here's what she has to say. However, data for the years before 1933 are known to be missing or incomplete for three reasons. First, they are based on death certificates only from states in the U.S. death registration area. The first 6 years of the published national level data from 1900 to 1905 represented only 10 states and the District of Columbia. Texas was the last state to enter the registration area in 1933. Second, admission to the registration area required initially only that at least 90% of deaths be recorded. Third, prior to 1907, deaths by homicide were often very underreported within the official death registration states themselves, since they were often recorded incorrectly as accidental deaths. So there you have it, folks, an overwhelming consensus from historians that the homicide rates prior to the year 1933 were dangerously underreported by the U.S. Census. So, how wild was the Wild Wild West? Well, let's find out. Randy Roth, the leading historian studying homicide rates, has a piece in Reviews in American History that examines two items of academic folklore. In this post, I address the widespread myth that homicides were rare in the Old West. In recent years, it has become fashionable for historians, such as Robert Dykstra and Michael Belasisi or whatever, to claim that it was a myth that the Old West was particularly violent. Nonetheless, other historians, such as Claire McKenna and David Peterson Del Mar, have reported very high rates of homicide in the West in the late 19th century. Who was right? Roth carefully reviews the data and confirms the work of McKenna and Peterson Del Mar, showing it to be consistent with recent work by Kevin Mullen, John Boesneckler, and the late great Eric Monenkin. Roth concludes, because the counties in McKenna's study reflect the diversity of rural, southern, and central California as a whole, there is reason to believe that the homicide rates in the southern two-thirds of the state, excluding San Francisco, was between 66 and 80 per 100,000 adults per year, the 99% confidence interval for McKenna's 7 counties combined. If we include San Francisco and Los Angeles counties, the interval for all Southern and Central California was between 60 and 70 per 100,000 adults per year, 7 times the homicide rate in the United States today. We cannot make assumptions about the homicide rate in Northern California, which is yet to be studied, but McKenna study alone, we have 29% of the population of Southern and Central California, 38% outside of San Francisco. And with the addition of Mullen's study of San Francisco and Monkenon's of Los Angeles, we have 57% of the population. The claim that the area was not unusually homicidal is statistically and arithmetically impossible. How homicidal was the Old West? According to the best historical evidence today, the answer is extremely homicidal. This is what the actual homicide rates were in the 1800s. As you can see, after the Civil War, during the Southern Reconstruction, it got to be as high as 20 per 100,000, and was also that high during the settlement of California in the 1850s. Shane Killian, if you're watching this video, I just got to say one thing really quickly. I never said that the U.S. Census was right-wing propaganda. What I said was that it's inaccurate. What I called right-wing propaganda was people like Robert Dykstra who use information that everyone knows is false to make absurd claims like the Wild West was near crime-free. That's right-wing propaganda. So the next time you hear a libertarian make the argument that the Wild West was crime-free, ask for his source. And if it's the U.S. Census, it is wrong. Deal with it.